Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I can see quite a few known faces, also quite a lot of new faces. Good to see people again, and also good to start meeting new people. It's a joint production between the Culture Factor Group and Blindspotting. In a moment, I'll talk a little bit about the Culture Factor Group and how are cultural dimensions connected to blind spots. And after that, Marty Dubin will talk a little bit more about blind spotting and what is the process that we go through on an individual basis. After both of our presentation, we're going to have a bit of a panel discussion between me and Marty in terms of sparring. When is it culture? When is it personality? How do we recognize blind spots on an individual basis, on a group basis, and how therefore can we move forward in a way that helps all of us individually and collectively to be mindful about blind spots and to leverage blind spots in order to work better together. So that's what you've got waiting for you in the coming, give or take, 60 minutes. So moving forward, how do we get from blind spots to breakthroughs? These are the pictures of me and Marty. These will be the main speaking voices you will hear today. Please do use the Zoom chat for active questioning during our presentation. We shall try to answer questions as they come along. We've got a team behind us that will assist with this as well. And in the end of today, we also have space for Q&A. So please do use that chat function without any doubt. So about the Culture Factor Group, we are a cultural analytics firm that has been active for over 40 years. And typically it's organizations that deal with people and numbers that tend to find the biggest breakthroughs when they engage with us, as we enable people to become more mindful of what kind of cultural blind spots do people have when they work across borders, when they work across functions, and even when they work between organizations. For those of you working in HR, undoubtedly, sometimes you have been hitting your head against the wall when you deal with finance or with legal, and vice versa. This is basically our playing field, you could call it. If we talk about culture, culture is about groups of people that have different coding embedded in their way of thinking and their way of behavior. Or as Hofstede, the big Dutch professor in the field of cultural analytics, has said, culture is about the collective programming of the human mind, which distinguishes one group from another. Now, if culture is about group differences, when do these group behaviors create collective blind spots will be one topic that we'll be addressing between me and Marty today. When we talk about culture, we distinguish between three different behavioral models or tendencies. There is how our society has coded certain behavior, certain perceptions in us. Think about the way you were schooled or raised at school or by your parents. There is our professional, call it blind spot or bias, which is our organizational culture or our functional culture. And then as consumers, we also have certain blind spots that create certain purchase behavior or do not create certain purchase behavior, which is obviously a sales challenge. So culture is something we look at through the lens of three different behavioral models. Now, one blind spot is something that you will all face every single day, especially if you work across cultures, with regards to meetings. So what I would like you to do, just to get a very piece of interaction here in this group of participants, if you think about your perfect meeting, which of the four meeting types would you describe as perfect? Is that a platform where everybody basically with clear objectives participates and we take a decision to move to the next step? So it's very action-oriented, short, to the point. That's option A. Is it a place where the leader gets a platform to make sure that everybody is basically aligned? The decision has already been taken, so it's more ritualistic in nature. Might be nice if you're a boss. Is it a platform for only the experts to come with pre-informed material, pre-read material, so that it's a very factual, structured approach? Option C. Or is it option D, meaning it's a platform where everybody should be able to join, everybody should be given a space to share their opinion, and that's it. We might not even need to take decisions. What would be your perfect meeting? Just put it here in the chat. Let's see what collectively you would prefer. And we have already, very quickly looking at the chat messages that come in, a mixture between mainly A and D. That's interesting. Are we perhaps collectively here having a cultural blind spot? Because if we were to work together with colleagues in, let's say, China or in Germany, they have a very different preference with regards to what is the ideal meeting. Now, this is just a very quick example of how collectively we can be coded to have certain perceptions with regards to what is an ideal way of working, an ideal working practice. And culture then basically slaps us in the face and says, nah, think again. Now, the good thing about culture is rather predictable. So by knowing a little bit more about culture, these are assumptions that you can actually test prior to being confronted with such a blind spot. Another example is when we talk about what is the role of a superior. Is the role of a superior to give clear guidance, clear direction, or is it the other way around? The ideal boss is a coach that gives space for everybody. Everybody should be able to take initiative. Now, to be fair, there is no right or wrong in any of these equations, but there is a different perception. And the challenge a lot of us face in work life is that we operate on autopilot with assumptions that have been shaped by the way we were raised and kind of shaped in college or in university or at an organization. And then we go with assumptions, which again creates blind spots that other people might have different expectations. The same goes for when we talk about our organizational culture or our team culture. What is more important? Is the process more important or is the goal more important? And what if SIL says the goal is important, but compliance says the process is important? Do we create space in our daily work to really explore where do we come from in terms of our preferences? Why do we have these preferences? And then collectively, after we have basically visualized all the potential blind spots, choose a common way of working that makes everybody feel at least equally somewhat okay. Ideally, of course, everybody would feel wonderful, but that's maybe too wonderful a world. So the whole idea of avoiding cultural blind spot is to make sure that number one, we understand where people come from. Number two, we understand what needs to get done. And number three, we find a way to get that sorted out together without missing assumptions. Now, for those of you that come here today, and predominantly because most of us in the first meeting question answered A or D, meaning US or the Netherlands, just by using that country comparison on our website, straight down the front page, you can already anticipate that for those of you that work in the more Anglo-Saxon way, short, decisive meetings are the preference. Yet for those of you that work in the more Dutch or Nordic way, yeah, decisions are nice, but we do like to talk about them before we decide. Yeah, so preparation is half the work. And our team has now put the link to that country comparison, which I strongly recommend to bookmark so that at least after today, you no longer have any excuses with regards to cross-cultural blind spots. Now, on that note, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Marty, the floor is yours to talk a little bit about blind spotting from the neurological and the individual perspective. Go ahead.
Thank you, Egbert. Pleasure to join you on this and welcome to everybody. So just from a context standpoint, I was trained as a clinical psychologist and then and had a private psychotherapy practice for quite a while. Got interested in the business of mental health, behavioral health care, and started a company where we manage the behavioral health care. So experience as a entrepreneur, founder, CEO. And then we sold the company, and then I joined a couple consulting firms, international consulting firms, US based, that are all psychologists consulting to business. So my lens started probably narrow around the individual, the one person in the psychotherapy room with me, and then kept getting broader. And then I wrote this book, Blindspotting, which is kind of the center of what we're talking about today. So what what you're seeing now is actually I'd rather start at the end before I start at the beginning to give you a sense of where we're going, and we're really going towards self-awareness. And that so I'll give you a sense of what blind spots are and where to begin to look for them. And the end goal, though, is knowledge is just because you have knowledge doesn't mean you know how to use the knowledge. And self-awareness is the tool in ourselves about how we use that knowledge of the blind spots, cultural or individual, to be able to create that action for us to behave in a different way that's more functional and more productive. So to begin to talk about blind spots, we really need to think about what makes up our personality. And so there's lots of ways psychologists have begun to kind of think about that, but I've listed 6 elements, and these are the elements that make up the blind spot areas in the book. And these should be normal words that you kind of understand and use in just everyday language. Most of the time when we're talking about somebody's personality and we talk about leadership, we're usually talking about the traits, those adjectives we use to kind of describe ourselves and our colleagues and where we think maybe our strengths are or areas where we'd like to improve. But really, we're functioning on all these levels at all the time. And so for us to kind of get a good sense of blind spots, we need to begin to kind of narrow in on all of these and understand how blind spots show up in these 6 different areas. The end of the day, and this is kind of the bridge back to the culture factor group, is that whoever we are as a person, we bring that into a particular context. And if we're not, so even if we are very self-aware of ourselves, which is the first goal, we also have to be very aware of the context that we're in. And clearly we're in different contexts, different cultural contexts, as Egbert was talking about. We're meeting with different people with different personalities. And these are the times when we can run into problems, because most leaders are effective 80-90% of the time. And my work really has been about what are those 10 or 15% of the time when you really aren't functioning at your best and you don't really know it. And typically it's in situations when your normal pattern recognition that leads to your default personality coming out, when you're in situations that really are calling for a different personality, a different behavior for you to exhibit. And unless you're self-aware, and realize how the context has changed or is different for you, you end up going to your default with just unconsciously without being aware of it, and somehow the gears are not gnashing well and problems arise. So what we've done is I've written the book. The book came out end of last July, and actually I had the experience of meeting Egbert and his team in Finland. We did a book tour through the Nordic countries and finishing in the UK last October. And so the book is the conceptual starting point. But what we've also developed is an assessment. And this, we'll talk a little bit about that at some point here today. The assessment is a way for you to be able to narrow in on where your blind spots are. It's a bit of a catch-22. If they're a blind spot, how can we know what they are? So the assessment is a very short 10 to 15 minute test that you take, self-administered, and then you can get a report back that's very kind of surgical. Rather, it doesn't look at your entire personality. It looks at where might blind spots be showing up. And then finally, the final step is an action plan. For us to change ourselves, our personality is pretty well set in many respects, but there are opportunities for us to make changes. And we need to do that in a very deliberate, focused kind of way. And so we also have an approach about how to, a 10-step approach about how to create a development plan for you to be able to use that self-awareness and actually make changes in how you show up. So what is a blind spot? It is, just as the name implies, it's something that you're not aware of. Those of you that are familiar with some work from behavioral economics and Nobel Prize winners of Hahnemann and Tversky, they talked about kind of fast and slow thinking. So fast thinking is what's automatic. If we slow our thinking down all the time to think about our thinking, kind of have that metacognition, we never get anything done. So most of the time we're operating on just our basic intuitive functioning that we've built over our lifetime, some of which clearly is genetic and some is through early life experiences, that we end up filtering in and filtering out what's important to us. And only when we can kind of stop and slow that down and look at our thinking and look at what we're filtering in and filtering out can we begin to get a sense of where blind spots might be and where they might be interfering with our functioning. Just to give you kind of one really kind of a complex example. I had a client who CEO of a company, Silicon Valley startup company, and his team was describing him as both humble and arrogant, which seems an impossibility in some ways when you think about those as really traits that are kind of opposite of each other. But he probably at a core level was humble, was certainly how he appeared most of the time. But there were times when he clearly appeared arrogant, and that was a blind spot for him. He would never have defined himself that way. But it turned out that when the responsibility of the role of the CEO was heavy on his shoulders, when he was feeling a sense of pressure to make a decision, then he appeared to his team as arrogant and not willing to listen to other ideas. His confidence and his responsibility really were on hyperactive, and he appeared arrogant at the time. So blind spots are very tricky. Often we need to look at the actual behavior to be able to kind of tease it apart and figure out where a blind spot might be. It's been interesting to me just recently, as we're all getting up to speed on neural networks and AI, how the development of AI, really the development of neural networks, is a bit of a model for, to some extent, how our brain works. Our brain is way more complex, but at the very basic, what's going on with neural networks is these very distributed computer and processing is looking for pattern recognition and then strengthening connections that it gets trained, the computer and gets trained as, yes, that's a correct answer. You know, cats have 4 legs and whiskers and 2 ears. You know, every time you see that image, you know, that is a cat. So that those connections get strengthened. And that's very similar to what goes on in our brain. That as we pay attention to certain things, as certain things have more relevance to us, we strengthen those connections, and those become our default ways of acting and behaving. And it goes throughout our personality in all those 6 areas. For example, I have an area of identity, what our identities are. And when you become a parent, before you were a parent, you didn't pay attention to diaper commercials and early childhood education and all sorts of things. And once you become a parent, those things are fascinating to you, and you're strengthening those connections, and you're filtering those in, and you're filtering other things out. And so blind spots are very much just a part of the way the system is created. It's not a value judgment. There's no right and wrong. It's just simply errors in our system. This is the blind spotting model, and I'll just give you just a really quick sense of this. More of that's developed in the book. But these are the 6 areas, and they're organized this way because on the outer rim, behavior and identity is where change can take place. The 4 that are in the middle are very well set. We have a set point for our different traits, for our intellect, for our emotions, and for motivation, what's important to us, what drives us. We can make some changes around the edges there, but really all those things in the middle show up in our behavior and in our identity. So our opportunity to change is to change our behavior and identity. It's a waste of time trying to change somebody's traits and say if you're too much this and too little that, you should try to change and be more one and less of the other. It's much more effective to be able to change how it shows up in your behavior. If you're an extrovert and you talk a lot, I'm not going to be able to help you change and not be an extrovert. I can help you, though, shut up in some meetings and get the cue of when you shouldn't be talking. And so you're changing your behavior, even though your core personality is still staying the same way as it has been. And just a final slide here, just to give you a sense of very quickly how our strengths can tip over and become our blind spots. This is probably the one area that's most accessible to leaders. And if you think about, give you a little quick exercise here, if you think about what are some key strengths that really you value in yourself, that are important for you think have been important for your success in life. And traits are the adjectives that you use to describe yourself or people use to describe you. So your confidence or your diligence or your conscientiousness or your hard work or your creativity, whatever those might be, think of 2 or 3 adjectives like that. And then I ask you to put the modifier TOO in front of them. What happens when you're too confident? What happens when you're too creative? What happens when you're too conscientious, when you're too analytical? And so that's giving you a sense of, something that works for you 80, 90% of the time, and that's a good part of your success, and it's just automatic and default about how you behave. But there are times when that's getting in your way, and often in certain situations, probably the exact opposite would be more an effective response to the particular context. But you have a blind spot and you're not aware of that, and it's interfering with your performance. So I think that's enough to give you a little flavor of the individual level at the personality level of blind spots, and I'll kick it back to you, Egbert.
Thank you, Marty. Now, when we met last year in Helsinki, the session we went through, it was for me an eye-opening element as a leader, also to kind of become aware of where are my own strengths, indeed becoming a blind spot the moment you add that to adjective in front of it. Now, before we scheduled today's session, we had a back and forth, and one of the questions that popped up is, if you think about leadership nowadays, and leaders are facing a lot of different types of disruption. AI, you mentioned too, is just one of those. What would be your advice with regards to helping leaders maintain the agility to switch, to code switch, to switch lenses, basically, whenever they work across regions? Because it might not only be national cultural differences, but let's say US East Coast and Silicon Valley more.
So I think it's a great question, and this is the kind of the intersection point, I think, between the personality and the personality blind spots and cultural blind spots. And I think your advice in what you presented, Egbert, was the more aware you are of where cultural national identities are and cultural tendencies are, the more you go into a situation with somewhat of a concept of how those where those differences are, you're already kind of set up to be able to evaluate what should I be doing, what's the best response in a particular situation. And I think similarly, I would add that the personality lens on top of that, I can just imagine, if you're in a more authoritarian culture, and you are personally more authoritarian, then you've got a double blind spot lens on yourself. And conversely, if you are different than, on the different end of the cultural dimension, then maybe you're a little bit more tuned in to kind of be aware of that. And what so the first step is that self-awareness of where are the opportunities for blind spots to interfere.
Yeah.
But then the real challenge comes in of what to do about it, because again, we default to our basic way of thinking. If we don't have some way of prompting ourselves to say, "Oops, right now, am I engaged in a particular blind spot at this particular point?" So I
Yeah.
think the pre-work is kind of what are the situations that could cause me to cause this blind spot to appear and to really get in my way, so that I can be ready to respond to that when it shows up. And often even just a little acronym or some little picture on your note card in front of you, something that kind of gives you the prompt to say, pay attention here.
Yeah. I really like that reflection. Now, that immediately feeds into a second question, because if blind spots are something that on an individual basis we as leaders and as people in general tend to develop, how can we as leaders make sure that we build in some collective redundancy to protect ourselves from engaging in our blind spot? So you mentioned earlier with Kahneman system one, system two thinking. When life is hectic, we tend to go on default. So how do we build in some collective redundancy to pause, to reflect?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question because, business is teamwork. It's not, I mean, there's individual work, but at the end of the day, it's teamwork. And the, the more we can kind of look at ourselves and say, I, where can somebody compliment me? Where can somebody help me? Um, and the ability to be self-disclosive. Hey, you all know me. I tend to be overly analytical and to a fault at times. So please, let's figure out a little kind of code to let me know when I'm overdoing it. And it can become fun and funny and clever, and it's bonding for a team to be able to do that. But it has to start with this sense of these are not strengths and weaknesses. These are just, I talk about gifts and gaps. It's just errors in the system. There's no, we all want to get better. And so how can we help each other as a team get better?
It's I really like that reflection to kind of indeed step away from strength and weaknesses, because what is a strength else somewhere can be a weakness elsewhere, and especially in the cross-cultural space, where assertiveness in some cultures is seen as the ultimate leadership characteristics, but in others it just means that, okay, a leader that talks a lot but listens very little. And in many cultures, leaders are those that are, not those that do. But it really goes back to this reflection on the words we use. So a blind spot sounds less accusative than a strength or a weakness.
Yeah, and it is that mixture of person and context all the time. There's no one right answer. And I love that about your work, that it just broadens that lens to the fact that context is so important, that you can be super successful in one context, take that same person, put them in a different context, and they're no longer successful. And I saw that in Silicon Valley. There were just brilliant entrepreneurs that had great successes behind them with product one or product two, and all of a sudden product three is a total failure, and it disrupts things, and people are like, "What happened here?" And really pulling it apart, you realize that the context was very different.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think we all know the public narratives of executives moving from one company to the next, and then all of a sudden nothing happens. Does that make them a worse leader, or indeed is the context such that their strengths, or in this case their added value, doesn't basically get the space it needs? Um, One thing you mentioned in terms of blind spotting and that space for self-reflection. Now, continuing on that line of when life is really, really busy, and even if we collectively agree on certain working practices to kind of hold each other to account or to support each other, depending on the wording we want to use with regards to each other's blind spots, I think one of the topics we talked about before we had the session today was the topic of psychological safety. Now, you mentioned that when people know each other really well, so there is a certain amount of psychological safety, certain amount of openness to basically disclose that, hey guys, I might need some guidance with this behavioral trait of mine. How would you advise organizations to go about creating that level of psychological safety? Does it have to start from the top? Is it dependent on leaders opening up and telling the team that, hey, I know I can be a bit analytical, but what's your view on this?
Yeah, I've often had people come to me after a talk on my book, and they say, "Well, I've got this team member who I really can see their blind spots, and you know, and I've tried to tell them about it, and they just won't listen. Can you help me talk to them about their blind spots?" And my first response is, "Well, have you first shared your blind spots and asked them for help, for them to help you on yours?" And I think that's your point, is that the leader really does set the tone for that psychological safety, as well as just the culture of the organization. And so the leaders at the top are doing that. And a real rule in psychology is disclosure breeds disclosure. The more you do, the more you're vulnerable, other people become vulnerable. And so you do have to go first as the leader, I think, in a very genuine way. And that may be, 3 months of that before you even begin to move it to the team, where you've really allowed that to be a process where it's not just kind of a one-time conversation, but that the people, as you said earlier, the behavior really has to kind of show the truth behind what the person is saying, and so behaving that way for quite a while. I guess one other point that you brought up was just that kind of when we're really busy. That sense of when we're under stress is when everything narrows and we are at higher risk for a blind spot. I think of two times when we're at really high risk for blind spot. One is in those times of stress, and we really then default back. I mean, if you think of the fight, flight response, it's just the
Yeah.
narrowing of everything down. Survival is all that counts. I'm not paying attention to am I a nice person or not? I just have to survive. And so just knowing if you're under stress or the team is under stress, you're at a heightened place for those default behaviors just to come out and for you to narrow and not have as many choices in how you behave. And the other time that blind spots really show up is, and I think this is so appropriate to your work, is when you're in a new company, a new team, a new role, a new culture. You're then under a lot of pressure, you self pressure, and you want to show up well. First 100 days, to be successful, what are you going to do? You're going to fall back on your default strengths that have helped you in the past, and not and maybe just totally get off on the wrong step because you didn't pay attention to how you're supposed to behave in this new team, this new culture, this new company.
Yeah. We have a nice cultural acronym for that called CLM, Career Limiting Move. Um, many acronyms, I guess, in any type of profession. Now, in both of our approaches, we use behavioral models. Um, from your experience, both from working with groups of people, but also as a psychotherapist, when an individual relies too much on data, what does that do to their ability to trust their gut? And when do people trust their gut too much at the expense of also looking at the bigger picture? How do you see this balance for leaders in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of think about behavior and kind of self-awareness and behavior change as there's kind of three components. There is that knowledge acquisition. I mean, there's a lot you need to learn. I mean, you're in a role. If you get into a new role, there's knowledge acquisition, and then there's skill development, practice and behavior, and what are the way of doing things. And then the third is that aware of who you are as a person and where your opportunities for change are. Advice, I mean, psychotherapy exists because advice doesn't work. You just don't tell somebody to change and they change. You have to figure out how to help that person find the way to change and get past the barriers to change that are in there. So it is really an art of kind of combining all of those, I think, kind of knowledge acquisition, skill development, and behavior change.
It's a nice reflection. It reminds me, like especially when we talk about cultural transformation and the role of leadership in there, in terms of another acronym CEO, cultural executive ownership. To which degree do CEOs purposefully moderate their behavior to display the type of organizational culture that they want in their team? And to your point, if we say psychological safety is important, yet a CEO never talks about it, or doesn't really open up about it, then of course in many cultures people will be wondering, it's like, okay, we talk this word, but do we really live this word? In your opinion?
Can I ask you a question? In my work, one of the more fascinating parts about it was that I worked in all these different companies, and if you're a consumer of a product, you kind of think every car maker must be about the same. The cars are different, but you still got to make a car. And then you go to work you consulted a couple different ones, and you see how culturally different they are in terms of your point about values. And you've got the values up on the wall, or it's the first screen that pops up on somebody's computer, and those are nice words, and they, thought a lot about what words are in there, but it does come down to the behavior. And so I'm curious to how you get a sense of behavior. What I found I would do is ask people, how do things get done around here? And then you start to get, descriptions that you then pull the values out of that, and then you can really see, are those the same values that are on the wall. But how do you begin to get your arms around culture?
It's kind of like when you ask me that question, those of the audience that know me know that, okay, now the box of Pringles is going to open. So I'll try to moderate how many Pringles I'm going to take out of that box. Um, Yes, anthropological observation is really powerful, especially sitting in on management team meetings. It tells you a lot about, okay, what is the actual dynamic here? But obviously that takes time and can be quite costly. So in our approach, we tend to do analytics. So we basically ask people a very simple question in a survey, which is, where I work, the following applies.
Hmm.
Option A, neutral. Option C. And then we basically start looking at pattern analytics. And if everybody describes the same pattern, we call this a strong culture, or a better word perhaps is a cohesive culture. Now, that doesn't make it an effective culture, because we can all be very happy doing the exact wrong thing. So then what really helps companies to be mindful is not only what is the behavior that we see, but two questions. Number one, does that behavior help us to execute whatever strategy that we need? Number two, does it make people feel somewhat okay? Because especially if you compare workplaces, let's say between US, UK, and continental Europe, there is a massive difference in the tenure that people have at companies. In the US and the UK, it's around 4 years that an average person works for a company. In Central Europe, it's about 8 to 10 years. Why is this? Because if people constantly get confronted with behavior that goes counter the words that are on the wall, people will leave the moment the pay is no longer enough, or the status is no longer enough, or the learning is no longer enough. And culturally, the US in particular, people are a lot more footloose with regards to switching employer, because there's a lot more opportunity and people don't mind the risk as much as they do in Central Europe. So back to your question, analytics help us to understand what are the tendencies of behavior amongst group. And then you can zoom in on leaders specifically in cases of transformation. Do leaders actually walk the talk? So if we talk about psychological safety, or if we talk about vulnerability, do leaders talk about their feelings? Do leaders address when other leaders are not walking the talk? So if we say people matter, results count, where do we put the focus? The people part or the results part? And it's the consistency, in my experience, that really matters with regards to where leaders and especially HR directors have blind spots. They think they know their culture, but in all of the assessments we do, and I think we diagnose about 150, 200 companies a year, 30% of those companies have the culture that people think they have. 30%. And that's the companies that are already mindful enough to actually assess it. So this goes to the point that I think for a lot of executives, their perception on their corporate culture in particular is a massive blind spot. And I think it was Duke or Columbia University that did a research and said that up 2,000 CFOs and CEOs, only 15% of said we have the culture that we need. So there is a lot of, I would say, space for improvement. Um, and I mean, everybody probably has seen the Undercover Boss series, where a boss goes undercover in a company. It's amazing. It's fantastic to look at. It's great anthropological fun. But how many bosses really do that, and how often can you really do that? And that's why surveys are a very cost-efficient way to come across a reality check, so to say.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I mean, it's so true in my experience that culture starts at the top. I mean, I've seen it. It's very true in young companies, startups and so on, because the personality of the founder is really what's created the company, and they tend to hire people similar to them or that fit their particular kind of personality. So it becomes very strong. It gets muted, in multi companies that have been around for a long time. But still, people are very focused all the time. The leaders are in a fishbowl. People are looking all the time at, how do they dress today? How are they behaving today? This is going on in the world. What are they, how are they responding to that? And some leaders are very tuned into that all the time and still are able to be authentic in who they are. And other leaders, I've seen leaders become less and less authentic as they rise in the organization because it's a response to that fishbowl effect. They kind of know how powerful that is, and so they try to kind of mute their own personality in some ways, and which is probably not the right response. And people are always then even more curious to try to figure those things out. But that's really where the blind spots are just most apparent and most effective, as you said.
Yeah, and I think jumping on that, I think it already starts with the concept of leadership. What are leaders? What is their responsibility? Does their responsibility step into my private life? Are leaders more like parental figures? And in much of the world, they are. They are expected to be caring, not just for you, but also for your partner, your kids. If they are sick, that you get some time off. It's kind of like loyalty that transcends the labor contract. And I think this goes back to also the point when we start companies as a leader. What is the role that we really want? Do we really want to be the boss when a company hits 300 or 500 people? Because it means we can do less of what we started the company for in the first place. But then have we become too accustomed to the status, to the power, perhaps to the freedom that the CEO role might give us? So I think it goes back to your point. It starts with this self-awareness that what is really the thing that drives us? Where do we find our energy? Now, we're entering the final 15 minutes of our chat today. I would also like to invite the audience to please do ask questions in the chat. Before the audience comes up with questions or during the process of typing their questions, and then Martin, me and you will talk basically about those questions as they come in. You mentioned the interesting equation there to AI and neural networks. Where do you, in your experience, see that the world has a blind spot when it comes to the impact of AI on work life?
That's a question that's being asked people that know a hell of a lot more about it than I do. But it's clearly, and just I think we all sense that this is an enormous change. It's like when computers happened, when the internet happened, work changed. I mean, file cabinets went away, paper went away. And when chat happened, when email, all these things totally change how we're behaving, and we're having to manage through it in real time. So I maybe my first impulse to respond to you is around self-awareness. That, the more we can be aware of that. I mean, one thing I always do with leaders, sometimes communication is an issue that we end up focusing on in coaching, and how people manage the opportunities to communicate. Do you communicate by email, by Slack, by a phone call, by a face-to-face? And what do you use to make the decision about the information that I want to share is better in which channel? And there's some very clear differences. I mean, you don't communicate emotional things on a keyboard. You need to do that in face to face. And so many people make that mistake because of a sense of urgency, and it's much quicker. I'll just type this up, and then all sorts of things go haywire. And I imagine we're going to have to be doing that with AI, is being so aware. I mean, already it's very hard to tell, did I write that or did AI write that, and how much of both of us? And I'm not sure what needs to be teased out there, but there's some self-awareness, I think, that's going to be called upon at even a greater level of precision.
It's interesting because I'm now currently enrolled in one course that talks about AI's influence on professions, so to say. And there I'm wondering as well, is that self-reflection of leaders focused on the role of AI on their business, on themselves, their profession? But then what happens to the role that AI has on that collective sense of belonging? Isn't that also what our leadership responsibility is, to make sure that the workforce basically is becoming more aware of the fact that, hey, AI might take away some tasks, but it's not going to replace your job. Or then maybe it is going to take away the job. So it's a collective reflection, I would argue, I guess, that are we collectively blind to the role work has in society? And what if we take that important component of our identity, perhaps, away? Are we socially ready for this? Are we ready to go back to basically walking through the forest and pricking fruits because AI is doing the work? But I
You
guess
know,
that's plenty of reflection to do moving ahead.
certainly where a lot of people go is AI won't replace the more human parts of work and interaction. And what's the most human thing that AI does not do anything with, and that's emotion. AI is able to make those connections from a knowledge standpoint and an informational standpoint and all of that, but it's totally devoid of being able to access emotion. I mean, in our brain, however it's constructed, we have biochemical, and we're flooded with emotion from time to time, and that emotion is the kind of the royal road in my work. It's like once you find that follow that, because it's going to lead to some very important kinds of things. So maybe all of the things around EQ and building our emotional sensitivity and awareness and bandwidth, maybe that's the positive outcome. It's going to force us to even be more and more
More
acutely
human.
in touch that.
Yeah, I like that reflection. It forces us to become more human. And maybe our team can also put in the chat the link to an article where we looked into, does AI understand culture? And the more or less unanimous reflection on the three major models is no, they're not understanding culture just yet, because that is about understanding emotional preferences. So to your point there. Now, we have two questions in the chat at the moment. First one coming, or three questions. First one coming in from Esme. Marty, could you define the identity item in the blind spotting self-awareness model? What do you mean with the identity component there?
Right. So we have multiple identities through our lifetime. Some that we get at birth, gender identity, birth order, kind of family we were born into, and other identities we take on through life. People tell us we're a certain kind of person, and sometimes we're aware of that and we say, no, I'm not, or yes, I am, or sometimes it's very subtle. Some identities, as I mentioned, those of you that are parents, at one time you weren't a parent and then you became a parent, and being a parent became a very important identity. So it's really, I found that working with leaders, sometimes they're not that aware of their identity at work. And so one question I ask them is, what's your brand? That certainly works well with CPG companies who are focused on brand all the time. And go do a brand audit. Ask people what your brand is at work, and then let's talk about what that is. I tell a story in the book, the identity chapter, about a woman who wanted to rise she was kind of number two and she wanted to become a president of a division. But her identity was and she kind of labeled it this way, to be the invisible glue, the behind the scenes person that makes everything work. And so she was getting passed over for promotions. Well, no surprise, she's invisible. And once we made that visible to her, what her brand was, it became a tremendous aha of, oh my gosh, I really need to think about how I need to change my brand to get where I want to go. So that's the point about identity, is how what you project to other people at work, and how what identities they put on you, and what identities are important to you. Maybe you have to change your identity to be able to function in a new company where you're at.
I'll make a nice pivot there to a question that came in terms of the impact of national culture, and I'll combine the question that Belob asked here in terms of the impact of blind spotting for different national cultures with a private question that came in that uh, I come from a hierarchical culture. How does an employee like me tell a leader he has, or she or they have, a blind spot? Should I stay silent? Now, obviously, from a cultural point of view, in hierarchical cultures, if you'll tell your boss you have a blind spot, that might be CLM, career limiting move. Um, Marty, in your experience, when you have worked with people that reported into hierarchical leaders, irrespective of if it was a hierarchical culture, but if it was a hierarchical top-down type of leader, in your experience, how have you gone about this question in terms of helping people to, so to say, lead the leader or manage the manager?
Yeah, I think first is that the frame of the question is part of the problem. Um, because really the question is, how do I give good feedback to my leader? And that's the frame of the question. Once you already start to think about it as this power dynamic, you're probably getting tied up in knots about it. So I'll give you an acronym from my corner of the world: SBI, Situation, Behavior, Impact. Um, and first off, feedback is only effective if the person is willing to hear some feedback. So I would encourage that person to say, I really I want us to have a great working relationship. Is it okay if I give you some feedback? Or I'd like to give you some feedback. So ask permission, create the openness for that. Um, and then use the SBI, be very behavioral. In last Thursday's meeting, when this topic was going on, so you're creating the situation, then you're describing the behavior. You um, stood up and talked in a very loud voice, and basically the impact on me was, I better be quiet right now and not push back anymore on this issue. Um, and so you're giving the leader feedback about they were being too authoritarian, if you will, but you're not judging them. You're not saying you were this way. You're just describing the behavior and the impact on you. And then be quiet for a moment, because at the end of the day, what you're saying is, I wasn't able to be as effective a employee at that moment, or a contributor, because the impact caused me to shut down.
It's a very nice reflection there in terms of being very specific with the feedback. Otherwise, also people maybe not are not able to recognize that what you described, or they are not aware of the consequences of the scenario described. Now, there's a question coming in here. Do you have an example of a company where a leader's blind spot became a feature of the company? So, for example, a leader being exceptionally assertive and the company being known for being exceptionally assertive. And is that an issue? Now, I have a take on this, but Marty, what is your take on this?
I guess what just came to mind, and it's not anything that from a personal experience, but that was certainly the message in the press about Uber. The leader of Uber was very aggressive, and the company was very aggressive. And when you think about it, maybe that's what they had to do. They were breaking apart a previous established dynasty of how taxicabs work, and they really were trying to totally change that. And so the only way to do it was to be really aggressive. And then that didn't work for them. And then they finally were starting to push things too far, and municipalities and states in the United States, and I imagine this happened throughout the world, were pushing back and putting regulations on, and then they figured out they've got to find some way now to collaborate. And It reminds me of a situation I had when I was CEO. My default response was to be very collaborative and agreeable, and we were in a situation where I was behaving that way and it wasn't working. And my takeaway was there are times when you need to be a peacetime CEO and times when you need to be a wartime CEO. And so I think some of these things work until they don't work, and then that's the pivot point where you need to figure out what do you need to be doing differently.
I fully recognize that scenario whereby, as a CEO, you need to be mindful of indeed how is your behavioral blind spot impacting the company's perception and overall collaboration space, and whether you need to pivot. And I think there's also other public examples with well-known car companies where leaders display certain behavior. But there, I think the cultural element is that if a company is known for being cutthroat, if a company is known for being on the top of their league, but that comes with certain consequences in terms of how you are expecting to behave, then people enter such environment knowingly. And therefore, it's not a blind spot. It's an acceptable risk. So I think that is maybe something that leaders can also take lessons from, that if you want to have a particular way of working and it's not going to necessarily be for everybody, to be unapologetic about it and really recruit people that fit in that environment. So it becomes a conscious choice as opposed to something that surprises people along the way.
I've been, the United States companies often get criticized. It's been very interesting to me for being so short-term focused. And you have other cultures where companies have lasted hundreds of years and generations, and they have this long-term focus on the longevity of the company, and it just creates very different decisions based on that, and that certainly obviously is cultural.
Yeah. Now, looking at the time, we are at the end of our time together today. At least speaking from my perspective, I hope that the audience has gotten new insights in what might be potential blind spots. But we are not leaving you with just this pretty slide. Maybe, Marty, you want to tell a little bit about what the QR code is about, and then I'll
Sure.
follow up on that.
Yeah, so the QR code will take you to blindspotting.com, and to the assessment portion of that, where you'll be able to take the blind spotting assessment that I mentioned earlier, at no cost for participants in the program today. And it was interesting when you were talking about how you evaluate culture, because the blind spotting assessment is very similar to that. It's a bunch of adjectives. It's built on a very long-standing psychological test called the adjective checklist, where you just go through and click very quickly on adjectives that describe you, and then it'll produce a report helping you kind of point to where you're at risk for blind spots.
Perfect. Now, also on behalf of the Culture Factor Group, we've got a special action at the moment, different timelines, that if you want to know more about how do I find out my organizational blind spots, or from a cross-cultural point of view, how do I know a little bit more about how national culture impacts perceptions, assumptions, and behaviors? Please also there contact our sales team with the information in front of you, and you can benefit from the special discount with the timing mentioned. We will summarize today's session with an email follow-up that basically gives you the information that Marty and me have just shared in terms of the special actions. That email will come to you more or less now. And the recording of today's video, once it's been rendered, will also be shared with all of you that have signed up early next week. On that note, thank you once more to all of you that have joined in on this Tuesday morning, afternoon, evening. And we hope to see you in future webinars. So in case you want to be kept up to date, do subscribe to the newsletter. Marty, thank you so much.
Thank you, Egbert.
Cheers.